Thank you so much. And thank you, Angelika, for all that we have done together on this journey. This is a talk about forgetting. And so it seems appropriate to begin it with a statue of the goddess Lethe, the Greek goddess of forgetting. Um, Lethe helps people to forget before they leave the underworld to go back into their lives. And in China, there is also a goddess named Meng Po or Po Meng, I'm not sure which, who does something similar. Um, we think about Lethe, and so did Sylvia Plath, who said, "Around our tents, the old simplicities sigh, sleepily as Lethe trying to get in. We'll wake blank-brained as water in the dawn." The question in this talk is, how blank-brained do we want to be individually and collectively? I need to warn you, there's some difficult content in this talk. We will be talking about the abuse and deaths of Indigenous children at the hands of white institutions and white settlers and colonists such as me. So I apologize for that. Um, in keeping with that spirit, and I know that this possibly will not be as relevant where most of the people are who are listening to this, but I need to say, for my own honesty, that I speak from the traditional, unceded, and contemporary lands of the Wampanoag and Massachusetts peoples. This is stolen land. I am on it as a colonist, as a settler. I honor their elders and ancestors, past, present, and future. This doesn't fix anything, but perhaps the talk will help us to make a small contribution to change. Here's the outline of the talk. It is, in the center of the screen, a rant surrounded by some academic stuff. So we'll talk about whether forgetting is a good thing or a bad thing. Of course, we're going to tell you that it's both. We'll spend a lot of time talking about how we forget in the data sciences and the data silences that are part of that forgetting. Again, some positive, some negative. They lead us to the rant, and then we'll close with questions about whose interests are served when we forget and what we do to cause forgetting. So forgetting has been considered beneficial in the research literature. We forget as an aid to remembrance. We try to remember what matters and we try to get rid of what doesn't matter because it distracts us and gets in our way. If there is a science of remembrance, there is a science of forgettance, and which studies exactly those processes, patterns, practices, engines of forgetting, which people use in order to focus on what matters. And so a number of people have concluded forgetting is an important part of memory work. That's not supposed to be a joke. It is ironic or catachristic, but it's also, we would claim, true. Forgetting has also been considered to be harmful. Proctor and Schiebinger asked plaintively, why don't we know what we don't know any longer? And we ask that all the time, all the time, all the time. But collective forgetting can be more than just why don't we know it anymore. Collective forgetting refers to how states and citizens selectively remember, misremember, and disremember to silence and exclude alternate views and perspectives that counter the official discourse. You'll see that we're going to be talking about that concept in much of the talk. So how do we forget? We're going to talk about data silences from several different perspectives. And at this point, I'm going to stop reading every word on the slides. I did send a copy of the slides to Danielle, so and there will be a recording of this. So I'm going to skip in order to stay within the time limit. But I'll read a bit here. Anokwa says, data silences are the blank spots that exist in spaces that are otherwise data saturated. Spots that we've left blank reveal our hidden social biases and indifferences. Redmond says much the same. And again, back to Proctor, who wrote the definitive work on agnotology, the science of forgetting. Proctor says, the focus here is on ignorance or doubt or uncertainty as something that is made, maintained, and manipulated by means of certain arts and sciences. That's us. Through a lot of reading, Angelika and I made this taxonomy of data silences. There's not time to do all of these. I'll review some of them that are most related to this talk. So let's begin with syntactic silences. Syntactic silences are places in the database that refuse the data. Classic example of this is LGBTQIA2S, where 2S is two-spirit in North America. If the database says sex or gender, it comes male and female, well, then all of those other values are discarded. If one is making a database of kinship relations and one is talking with people who are not from, say, Europe, There's a bunch of kinship relationships that may not be coded into the database and may be thrown on the floor because the database is not ready to understand those kinds of family connections. So syntactic silences are subtle. We don't see them. They operate, and arguably they operate all the time. Let's turn to another kind of silence, substitution, where we use a trace of the data rather than the data themselves. And of course, this happens all the time. Here's Certeau, but we could quote many other people. The operation of walking can be traced on city maps. These refer, like words, to the absence of what has been passed by. They allow us to grasp only a relic set in the know-when of a surface projection. The trace left behind is substituted for the practice. And so this kind of data silence, where something is substituted for something else, and the thing that we see is less than the reality of the thing that it is replacing, leads to the next kind of data silence, which is, it's an acronym. What you see is all there is. The assumption that, well, we have the data must be complete because, well, they're the data, right? And they're in our data set. And it's our data set, and our data set is perfect. And so we tend to reify the substitution by forgetting that we substituted. Annulment is another kind of data silence. Here we forget the distractions that would interfere with the current task, and we have some examples of that. Again, the notion of focusing on what matters. And so Clayton D'Souza and others have done some really lovely work on how application programming interfaces work. They suppress the unrelated details, the stuff that we don't need to think about at the moment. And in fact, they operate in many ways that are rather social rather than purely technical. We have these principles of encapsulation and modularization. And the nice thing about those is they're usually reversible. We shift our attention, we encapsulate the stuff we don't want to look at now, we can bring it back later. So we have aids to recovering what we've temporarily forgotten. And so thus temporary forgetting can be beneficial in software engineering. And I refer you to Clayton's work, it's really wonderful. The question though for us is, are we temporarily or permanently forgetting things? So the next two categories of data silences come from that. Structural amnesia is how we want to be remembered, and those of you who've read Irving Goffman may see a relationship here to impression management. And redacted data is the removal or obfuscation of data typically from vulnerable populations. And so here in the sort of middle left is Angelika's work with sex workers who needed to communicate with each other. They needed to be able to say things like, don't go with this client because he'll hurt you. And Rosie Bellini's work with survivors of domestic abuse, there's a need to communicate, there's a need to share knowledge, and there is a need to be invisible to certain people who may be trouble, past spouses, past partners, the police, etc. A different sense of structural amnesia and redaction is trans people trying to get their names corrected in, for example, academic databases, where they need to have their current name, their trans name, replacing their dead name, the name they used to have before they transitioned. And that, as especially Kater Spiel's work has shown us, can be a great deal of work to make happen. So again, sometimes forgetting is a useful thing. Sometimes forgetting is actually necessary for the survival of the people whose data we are dealing with. Now we turn to some of the more complicated aspects of data silences. And one that's close to my heart. Selectively legible data are forms of boundary objects which are interpreted differently by different stakeholders. So let's look at a song. When the sun comes back and the first quail calls, follow the drinking gourd. It'll carry you to freedom. This is a traditional freedom spiritual, seems pretty straightforward. It's a map. It also describes two small rivers and a big river, a pass between two hills. There's even a line that says, the dead trees will show you the way. Moss grows on the northern side of the dead trees. And so people in the US South during slavery who were trying to escape slavery needed this map song in their heads because they couldn't read. In fact, they would be punished severely for knowing how to read. But a song is a song and you can sing it and it's in your head. And so the dead trees will show you the way, even if you can't see the drinking gourd, which is the Great Bear celestial formation. It points at the North Star. It points to the north, to freedom. If you can't see it, if it's cloudy, still you can find the lichen growing on the dead tree, on the north side of the dead trees. And enslaved people knew the code. As I said, the drinking gourd was the Big Dipper. Canada was often a code word for heaven because there was freedom there. Excuse me. Moses was the name of actually multiple heroes, but especially Harriet Tubman, who guided people to freedom. And the slavers were ignorant of all of those, and so people could teach each other these songs in front of the slavers and not be beaten for it. So selectively legible data give us many, many things to think about in the way of who needs to know what, how we communicate with whom through what kinds of codes. There's a bunch of politically complex forms of forgetting, and in the interest of time, we're only going to talk about the last one, colonial unknowing, which is an attempt to render knowledge, in this case indigenous knowledges, impossible, and therefore sort of taken out of our knowledge. And so here is part of the sad history of North America. And I'm saying North America because this is Canada as well as the United States. But I also need to say, why am I telling people in the United Kingdom about North America? Similar patterns occurred in other historically English or British colonies, South Africa, Australia, I believe New Zealand as well. So all of us colonies are kind of in this together, and it's terrible. So I'll be talking about the stolen generation. In the United States and Canada, that's becoming relatively well known as a phrase. I don't know if it works in the UK, so I'll explain it. The stolen generation of Indigenous children were legally kidnapped from their homes, subjected to forced labor and other forms of abuse in what were called at the time residential schools. The ones who died of abuse were buried on the school grounds. This happened all over North America, Canada, and the United States. Canada is a little bit further ahead in rediscovering these things. So far, and this is actually an old figure, so it's probably larger now, over 7,000 graves have been discovered to date, but 90% of the sites have not yet been analyzed. What makes this very interesting from the point of view of unknowing, that is the action of removing from knowledge crucial information, is that school authorities have removed grave markers and or paved over the burial grounds, turned them into parking lots. Or they sent the records, the only records that survived, to the Vatican so that they could no longer be queried by courts in North America. Some schools even had crematoria for the disposal of young bodies. And if that sounds to you like mid-20th century history in Europe, there's a very good reason for that. One school had applied torture through a non-lethal electric chair. These are crimes against humanity, and we have tried not to know them. Here, for example, is what people found in a dumpster. These were the records. The records were being destroyed. The original records were sent to the Vatican where they could not be obtained by courts of law. So if these are crimes, and if they're unknown, then we would like to ask who performs this unknowing. The perpetrators certainly know what they did. They removed the grave markers. They paved over the graveyard. The one thing they didn't count on was ground-penetrating radar, which is going to reveal the evidence of their crimes after all. The people whose children were stolen, or whose children came back broken, they know what the perpetrators did. It's just the public and the judiciary that are supposed not to know. And in Canada especially, but also in the United States, there's now a strong court record of attempts to seal the evidence, attempts to obscure the evidence perpetrated by the governments of those two countries, one of which is my country. And so, as Sabatia said, there are implications for our own practices in this practice of unknowing. And those implications fit into the grand narratives of data science. Here's one version of the grand narratives. This has become popular to say that data is the new oil of the digital economy. It's, as you can see, it's said in all sorts of fancy places. And that feeds into the notion of data science as objective and inevitable, wherein the data take on a kind of authority that denies how they got to be data through the actions of human beings. And so the claim then is, well, if something goes wrong, it must be biased data causing our innocent software to produce biased outcomes. We want to ask, what if our software itself is not so innocent? Bowker told us famously, raw data is both an oxymoron and a bad idea. And so what's the opposite of raw data? Well, it's cooked data. And so people of goodwill have to cook their data in order to make their data fit for purpose, but we need to ask, how do we cook our data and what are the consequences? So this brings us to the rant, unless you think I've been ranting all the time. So we're going to build a forget and stack in machine learning. And often things begin with a measurement plan. Pine and Laboran talked about this, where people decide what are going to be data and what are not going to be data. That's a human decision. And what the plan is for maintaining those data. Then we go and we discover or capture the data in Hélène Billis's analysis of those two activities. And that activity begins to obscure the measurement plan. After all, there are realities of how we find the data. It may not be perfect, may not really be what we wanted. One IBM project went through three radically different sources of data in order to solve a client problem. And of course, even if we're discovering data, well, that's a human being who's deciding the thing that's discovered is data. These are speech acts. The data just sit there in the world until someone says, these are data. And then, like, I now pronounce you spouse and spouse or other speech acts. I now declare this entire continent the property of Her Majesty. That's a speech act too. And so we do speech acts when we decide what are data. Then we need to clean the data responsibly. Everybody needs to do this. Data are messy, they're raw. And as we just said from Bowker, raw data are a bad idea. And as we clean the data, we tend to forget that we captured or discovered the data to begin with and that there was a measurement plan. And as we clean the data, what are we doing? We're changing the data. So the data which we said were perfect to begin with, we now change. We curate the data. We say, oh, well, that's an extreme value, so we're not going to analyze those records. But what if the extreme values, say, are low incomes? We may have just cut out the impoverished people from the data set. Or what if there's a strong correlation between a certain other kind of outlier data and a particular socioeconomic group or racial group or ethnic group? Curating data then is necessary in order to make the analysis run and is fraught with danger because we may curate out our friends, our neighbors, our loved ones, ourselves. Then we engineer features. This is exciting because we're making new data from the old data. Typically, these are nonlinear combinations of data, and I think if there's time, I'll tell a story about that afterwards. But it's easy to encode a social prejudice into the features that we engineer, not because people have ill will, but because they're doing the best they can, working quickly. And they're not sociologists. They're typically software engineers, and they're making the best feature they can think of with very, very good will. And inadvertently, they're coding their own social biases into those features. Then we make up data from whole cloth. We label data, it's a blank column in our data set until we write the values of ground truth data into that. Sometimes experts do it. Sometimes experts do it well. Sometimes experts do it chaotically. We have a paper in Chi 2021 about that. Sometimes we crowdsource it on the internet and we don't even know the people who are telling us what the ground truth is. At one point, we thought we might write a paper saying that ground truth was neither grounded nor true because the way that we collect the ground truth data has so many opportunities for errors. Then we train the model, and around now we begin to forget all of these uncertainties that happened before the data got to the model. The data, after all, are the data. They must be great, so then we evaluate the model. In IBM, we evaluate the model for bias. I hope most people do that. I'm not sure that's happening yet. But now it's the model that we're talking about, no longer the data, but we worked so hard to make the data fit for purpose. Then we create the pipeline, and in some cases, we wrap all the details of the model, of all of those prior steps, inside the pipeline and seal it off so that other people can't even look to see how innocent our data were, and then we deploy the pipeline. And through all of this, of course, there are people involved, but everything that all the illustrations that I did up until this moment had no humans around. So human-centered data science reminds us to look at the people. They are crucial. They are trying to do good things. They are sometimes messing it up. And then there's this sound, kind of like what happens when you raise the window blinds, clack, 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 and all of those details disappear, and all we've got is the pipeline. And we might remember for a little while that people designed the pipeline, but eventually all we've got is the bright, shiny object of the pipeline. And all of those things that we did, all of those uncertainties that were in the data and that we introduced into the data through our non-innocent software, are invisible. We've systematically forgotten all of the information that could bring doubt on our pipeline and on its outcomes. But is data unknowing really as serious as colonial unknowing? And this is a whole talk in itself, this one slide, but in colonial unknowing, the European project in most of the colonies was theft of land. Now we do that through loan denials. And how do we do loan denials? We encode into the data set, into the processing of the data, certain social assumptions that cause people to be denied loans. That sometimes it's a loan for their house, sometimes it's a loan for their business. And curiously, we deny more loans to people of color than to white people. We deny more loans to women than to men. It is said that trans women of color don't get loans because they're not even in the database. So our data unknowing of loan denials corresponds in some ways to the theft of land under colonial unknowing. As you heard, in colonial unknowing, we Europeans stole tens of thousands of children from their families and killed some of them, not because we wanted to, but because we didn't care. And today we have Child Protective Services, which applies data norms based on a white middle-class population to people of color, to Native nations. In the state of Minnesota, Native families, that is indigenous families, are 3 times as likely to lose their children to Child Protective Services than white families. We are still taking the children away from their families. In colonial unknowing, there have been laws, at least in the United States and to some extent in Canada, that white crimes committed on Native lands cannot be prosecuted on Native lands. The criminals are referred over to white legal systems, which often, forget all about what they did. And when we apply data science to this, we have sentencing algorithms and bail granting algorithms, and they are shown over and over and over to be racially biased, and we still use them. In colonial unknowing, we provide, at least in the United States, a rather inferior form of medical treatment called the Indian Health Service. And in the broader sense of data science, medical treatments are based in part on the spend that the patient has previously built up in the medical system. But of course, poor people try to avoid medical expenses because they can't afford them anyway, especially in the United States. And so as a result, we deny medical treatment to people because they're so poor that they haven't spent very much in the medical system. And so data unknowing can be another form of colonial unknowing. It's another way that we European descended people around the world, continue to perform the evils of colonialism in a different way. By unknowing the uncertainties in our data, we perform a kind of God trick, as Donna Haraway taught us to think, legitimizing the data methods as scientific, objective, and inevitable. We keep the data, but we discard the human traces that used to be in the data. Almost done. We have 2 ways of reaching a conclusion. The first is the innocent version. Memory is a social practice that links people and things through time in the process of shaping history. It's a way of remembering what matters, and there are dispositional practices that can be studied and have been studied to select what memories we need to preserve, select them for preservation. Memory practices are very much part of the scientific cyber infrastructure that tell of an idealized past through established protocols and technical devices. We establish the protocols, we use the technical devices. This is us. But in the data sciences, we don't even possess our own past. We've systematically arranged to unknow the past of our own data. And I like this phrase from Fitchett: seeking out memories of remembrance like a tongue reaching for a loose tooth, prodding the peculiar ache of memory. If we think about it, our data practices are filled with the ache of memory, and we've lost a great deal of what we might need to know to find out what we've done wrong. Which leads to the other form of getting to the conclusion, motivated forgetting. Again, from the founder of the field of agnotology, the practice of ignorance, the focus here is on ignorance, on something that is made, maintained, and manipulated by certain arts and sciences. We are the sciences. Agnotology is part of what we do. We do this, oddly enough, in a way that converges with discourses of legitimation, as Leotard wrote. The grand narratives that say that our data science practices are objective and inevitable, and certainly should be used by everybody, no matter how much harm they cause. We do various forms of selective forgetting through the data sciences. We keep the data and a bit of impersonal metadata, but we forget the people. We forget the small data in service of the big data. And so our strategies of forgetting in data science, inadvertently or advertently, your choice, become strategies of legitimation in data science colonialism. And so one way of thinking about this, one way forward might be, this is a socio-technical problem, and so it needs both practices, the socio, and technologies, the technical, maybe to begin to make things better. And so we can focus on how we refine our data. Those are human practices. How do we make changes? How do we record those changes? And then our technologies maybe should help us to record those changes rather than to throw away the evidence of the changes that we've made. If we do that properly, we can reverse the changes as we need to, analogously to Clades and D'Souza's work on APIs, encapsulation, and so on. When we curate data, there are unintended consequences. We could monitor what's happening as we do the curation and watch those consequences begin to pile up and maybe prevent them. For feature engineering, we desperately need to know what the rationales are because we may botch them. My friend botched when he was trying to do a simple version of what percentage of your life have you been employed, and it was filled with social assumptions. We can at least record those in descriptive information about data columns. And for labeling, well, we know that sometimes everybody agrees on the label and sometimes there are disagreements. And what do we do on our data set? We take the most popular label and we forget that there was a disagreement. So we can also record the history and processing of labels. So for example, in a data frame, here's a sort of conventional data frame. I think Python pandas or something like that. We have column headers and then we have rows which are the data. And these just record the values, and if we impute a missing value, it replaces what used to be there. If we curate out somebody, they disappear from the data. So maybe we need the opportunity to have a data memory. What was it like before we made the change, or the changes? So this may be more than one layer thick. Maybe we need a social memory. What did we do? Why did we do what we did? When we come back and say, how did this go so wrong? How did we cause so much harm? Then someplace in the social memory we can understand how we made a mistake in the data memory and then we can fix it. We are not in a position to do that now. And of course, then part of our task is to connect the data practices and the data technology so that we have a coherent socio-technical solution for all of this. I don't say I know how to do this, I just say I think it needs to be done. So the conclusion, finally. We've talked about unknowing practices as discourses of legitimation, of making data sciences seem more reliable, more inevitable than they are. Can we make our forgetting practices recoverable? If we can do that, we may be able to make them more ethical than they currently are, see all the damage that we cause in policing, in medicine, in child protective services, etc. Can we improve our infrastructure for doing this kind of work? Who needs to forget? Who needs to remember? When do they need to do each of those things? Because we mostly all both need to forget and need to remember at different moments when we're working with data. And if we focus on forgetting, on unknowing our own weaknesses, we inadvertently project the power of the people who asked us to make these systems. We need to remember in order to reduce that power. I'm just going to skip. Can we calibrate our forgetting and our remembering so we know when to do it and for whom to do it and under what circumstances to do it? And can we make these questions legible for people who didn't go to fancy schools the way we did, who have different vocabularies, different cultural practices, different ways of knowing the truth of data? So here's Leave again, finally. We're just at the next to last slide. I said we'd come back to this. We'll wake blank-brained as water in the dawn. How blank-brained do we want to be? How much actually do we want to be remembering rather than blank-brained about our data practices? And so finally, some questions. And I don't have good answers to these questions. I hope maybe your answers are better than mine. What data do you systematically forget in your data practices? Who wants you to forget those data? And whose interests are served by your forgetting? I hope maybe we can talk about those questions and maybe you can teach me how to do my job better. Thank you very much.